Hi, I'm Dr. Diane Fuselier-Thompson, and I'd like to introduce NASW Code of Ethics. This introduction to the NASW Code of Ethics is intended for students who are new to the field of social work practice. As a precursor, the NASW Code of Ethics guides our social work profession and practice by identifying ethical standards for the professional activities of all social workers, but also social work students, regardless of their professional function, their practice setting, or the populations they serve. In this overview of NASW Code of Ethics, I have included the most recent revisions to the Code of Ethics that was adopted August 4th, 2017. In this brief overview, I'm going to focus our discussion on the 6 core areas in the Code of Ethics and what it covers: the core values, ethical principles, assisting with ethical dilemmas or uncertainties, the socialization of new social workers to the field, accountability, and providing a sense of standardization of expectations of social work practice. As I mentioned previously, although there are 6 primary areas of ethical standards in the NASW Code of Ethics, for the purposes of our time, I'm going to focus our discussion on social workers' ethical responsibility to their clients. As mentioned previously, I'll focus our discussion on the social workers' ethical responsibility to clients within the NASW Code of Ethics. In the first category under ethical responsibility to clients, there's an ideal of self-determination and the social worker's role in assisting the client in identifying goals for themselves, as long as those goals do not go against any laws or provide an imminent risk to the client or others. The second is being able to provide informed consent. The social worker should always be cognizant that their client is able to provide a valid consent within the context of that professional relationship, and they're able to understand the scope of the services that are being provided. In the event of a client who is illiterate, unable to read, or unable to understand the language within the context of that relationship, social workers should do diligence in trying to identify translators or interpreters for that purpose. The capacity to perform and to provide informed consent is critically important to the social workers' ethical responsibility to their clients. In the same breath, social worker competency is also critically important in terms of our responsibility to our clients. Being able to provide culturally competent services within the scope of practice by proper training, proper licensing, and also being trained in the proper interventions and techniques that are being used within that practice environment is critically important. And so, as the kids would say, be sure to stay in your lane. You want to make sure that you have competent training in the area in which you are providing services. And secondly to that is cultural awareness and social diversity. Within our scope of practice, we have a wide range of clients that we serve from diverse backgrounds and ethnicities. So it's a good idea to have a good cultural understanding of the population that you serve and their understanding of their ethnic responsibility um, within their particular cultural group as well. Um, so that is also a good practice to be aware of. And finally, under this category, there's the area of conflict of interest. Social workers should be aware of any potential conflict of interest that may interfere with their professional discretion as they provide services to a client. That could potentially be perceived as an unfair advantage of their professional relationship, and also avoid any communication with clients using technology on social media. Um, that can muddle the waters in terms of your professional relationship and could potentially be perceived as a personal relationship on social media. So social workers have to be really careful in terms of how they are utilizing technology, one in the context of that professional relationship, but also outside of that relationship. Be aware of any personal affiliations that may be discoverable on websites or social media. Another area of critical importance under the NASW Code of Ethics and our ethical responsibility to clients includes the privacy and confidentiality of our interaction with our clients. And that includes all of the information, including written documents as well as electronic records that are included in that professional relationship. In this age of electronic records, it's important that we protect the confidentiality of those electronic and as well as the written documents. And social workers should develop, if you don't have a company that you're working with, you should develop your own policies and procedures for notifying clients if there's ever a breach in the confidentiality of those communications. And as you know, in this age of social media, social workers should avoid at all costs identifying or providing any confidential information about clients on websites or within the context of social media. It's critically important that we protect that information and create a safe space for our clients. Um, and secondly is social workers should allow and provide access to records for their clients. And this is reasonable access for clients and assist them in interpreting records that are important to their development. There is some rationale when the withholding of records would in some way harm the client or that professional relationship. Um, and also, and that we have an ethical responsibility to our clients that under no circumstances will we ever engage in any sexual activities or inappropriate sexual communication. And that includes the use of technology or in person with clients for any reason. And you shouldn't engage in sexual activities or have any sexual contact with former clients because of the potential harm to that client and the client social work relationship in terms of integrity as well. And the other thing that I get this question from students before is that should you provide clinical services to persons with whom you've had a prior sexual relationship? And the answer is no to that as well. Um, that's clear in our NASW Code of Ethics that that's not a relationship that would be governed as an ethical relationship to a client. And then there's physical contact with the client. We owe our ethical responsibility to clients not to have any physical contact with clients, and it can potentially cause a psychological harm to them in some way. And that includes, caressing a client or having inappropriate physical contact. Um, Also, that includes sexual harassment, harassing clients or making sexual advances, sexual solicitation, requests for sexual favors, either written, verbal, or electronically, um, are not warranted in the scope of our ethical responsibility to clients. The last set of categories that cover our ethical responsibility to clients, including not using any kind of derogatory language in our written, verbal, or electronic communications to clients. We should always strive to be very respectful in our communications about clients and in our verbal communications with colleagues. I'm sure you've seen, the hush uh, signs on elevators and hospitals and clinics. And that is to not even have these sidebar conversations when you're talking about clients. Those are not confidential areas. Next is payment for services. When we're setting fees, we should ensure that our fees are fair and reasonable um, and consistent with the services that are being performed. But also, social workers should give consideration for the client's ability to pay for services as well. And some agencies do have a sliding fee scale for that purpose. And as I mentioned previously, we should always make sure that we are working on behalf of our clients who may not have the decision-making capacity to make decisions for themselves. So we should take reasonable steps to ensure that a third party, that may include petitioning for guardianship or having a next of kin, make decisions for our clients who are unable to make decisions for themselves and provide informed consent. And then there's referral for services. I mentioned earlier, a lot of students have said to me, yes, stay in your lane. And by that we mean stay in your scope of practice. And when you see that the client's needs go outside of your scope of practice, do not hesitate to refer clients to someone who has that area of expertise. And take steps to facilitate that transfer of responsibility. Um, and then finally, termination of services. There should be a process in most agencies and hospitals and other areas in which you work. There's a process to terminate services when you can no longer meet the needs of the client. So social workers should take reasonable steps to terminate services and go through that process with clients. And it's consistent with policies at agencies, or you should develop your own. The next couple of areas actually cover the NASW Code of Ethics and primary responsibilities of the Code of Ethics. So our second primary focus is the social worker's ethical responsibility to colleagues. Um, I will cover these briefly, but at the end of the presentation, I do have the website on NASW where you can go and get additional information. So the second area I want to cover is social workers' ethical responsibility to colleagues. And so even though your colleague may or may not have responsibility for direct service to your client, there is an area that we have responsibility to respect our colleagues in terms of representing accurate and fair information and the obligation of our colleagues in the role. So sometimes you may serve on an interdisciplinary team. Respecting the input of colleagues is critically important, as well as the confidentiality of that information. Usually it's shared in a way. I know that I've served on an interdisciplinary team, and it may be information that's vital to your role as a social worker. So being able to maintain the confidentiality of that information is critically important, which brings us to our next area, which is interdisciplinary collaboration. Members of an interdisciplinary team, you participate and contribute to decisions for the well-being of the client. And so that's a collaborative effort, but again, the focus is the client, and it's critically important that you maintain all the same areas that you would in your services to the client, but also to your colleagues as well. Um, when there are disputes involving colleagues, um, an employer could take a position to advance the social worker's own interest, but the idea is that you are able to resolve or engage in a discussion to resolve conflicts with other social workers as well as your colleagues. And social workers should seek advice and counsel from colleagues when those consultations are in the best interest of your clients. For example, as a therapist, you would consult with a psychiatrist, for example. There may be a need for medication for your client. On an interdisciplinary team, there are a multitude of other areas that may help support the client's well-being. And so, for example, in a hospital, you may have a physical therapist, a medical doctor, internal medicine, a cardiologist, you have a case manager, a nurse, a social worker, and all of them work together in a collaborative way in which to achieve optimal health for the client. So critically important that you consult with these other disciplines um, and that you engage in ethical conduct with these colleagues as well. Another area that the NASW Code of Ethics governs is the social worker's ethical responsibility in their practice settings. And this is another critical area. As all of you know, you will have a clinical assignment. Clinical hours are necessary to obtain either your BSW or MSW degree. And so this area actually governs your behavior and your ethical responsibilities in that practice setting. And briefly, they include, making sure that you have the necessary knowledge and skill when you arrive in that setting. So that's typically achieved from your coursework, but some of it is on-the-job training as well, that you'll come to realize that, you may get from more senior social workers, understanding cultural boundaries, understanding, areas of practice and knowledge and competence that you may have to get, on the job training. But you develop that education and training through your supervision and consultation with other social workers in your practice field. Making sure that you have the adequate education and training for the area of practice that you intend to pursue, and that you take reasonable steps to inform providers that you are a student when training. It's important that you have regular performance evaluations, so whoever is supervising you in that clinical practice setting, that you get feedback on your performance in that practice setting, on your progress in terms of your expertise. You're held to the same standard as a student, as a social worker, as it relates to client records, client billing. All of that should be reflective during your practice setting, and you should become very familiar with that. When there's a client transfer, a social worker should also agree and support the needs of the client if that client needs to go into another setting. So there's a process for that that's very clearly delineated in most agencies. So social work students should be very clear and have a clear understanding of that transfer process. I know in the hospital there are sometimes hospital to hospital transfers. Acute care patients may go from an acute care setting to a less restrictive setting, which may include a rehab setting, a nursing home, or they may go home with home care. So what does that transfer look like? Transferring information to another set of professionals is critically important for the continuity of care for that patient. And then there's continuing education and staff development. As many of you know, you're here to get a social work degree, whether it's a BSW or MSW, and that's critically important to your future as a social worker. But it's also important that you regain and continue your education and your development of skills for your practice setting. So that's critically important. It needs to be documented not only for your licensing exam, but it also needs to be documented in many instances for your continuing education credits, and also for many of the practice settings that you will be assigned to or work for post MSW or post BSW as well. Our next area of focus is the social worker's ethical responsibility as a professional. And this goes back to our slide 9 in terms of our social workers being competent. Having the basic competency is critically important to hold yourself out as a social work professional, and participating in continuing education to keep your skills new and current with the times. Um, as an ethical responsibility under the NASW Code of Ethics, it's important that social workers not practice, condone, or facilitate any form of discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, national origin, color, sex, or sexual orientation, gender identity, age or identity, marital status, political belief, or immigration status, or mental or physical ability. It's important that social workers not allow their private conduct. And again, I have to talk about social media because that's what gets a lot of people, there's some conflict there in terms of what they identify as private behavior versus their role as a social worker. But being clear on what is your private statements versus your statements as a social worker. The social workers not engage in any dishonesty, fraud, or deception of any kind that would misrepresent your credentials and your professionalism. Social workers should not allow their personal problems to interfere with their ability to provide professional care to their clients, and if so, should seek immediate consultation and remedial action by getting professional help. And then finally, misrepresentation. It is assumed that social workers will make a clear distinction about what their professional social work practice is, their professional social work organization, and also to speak on behalf of professional social work organizations. They should accurately reflect their position, their credentials, their education, and their competency as a social worker in their scope of practice. The fifth area of primary focus in the NASW Code of Ethics is the social worker's ethical responsibility to the social work profession. And so what do we mean by that? We mean upholding the integrity of the profession, advancing the values, the ethics, the knowledge, and the mission of social workers, and also the competency of social work professionals, promoting the respect for social workers, and also contributing to the knowledge base of social work practice as it relates to practice, research, and ethical behavior. Regular attendance at conferences and presenting, information, staying current and abreast of social work practice is critically important. Social workers should also be involved in the regular monitoring of policies and practice within their practice settings. It's important that those who develop policy understand how programs can be implemented and how these practice interventions are feasible for social workers in their practice setting as well. So critically important for social workers to remain involved in the profession, like I said earlier, in their continuing education credits, but also within their scope of practice as it relates to policies and procedures for their client population. Critically important as an ethical responsibility to the social work profession. And finally, our last area of primary focus in the NASW Code of Ethics is the social worker's ethical responsibilities to the broader society. And by that I mean the social welfare of the clients we serve and the general welfare of society as a whole. And that means locally in your community where you live, where you work, the broader society, and also on national and international scope. Um, Being protective of the environment and advocating for living conditions that support the basic human needs of all individuals, regardless of political or cultural values. That is a critical responsibility of the social worker to our broader society. And that includes public participation, um, shaping policies and being involved. Um, in your communities where you live or work or both, providing professional services in public emergencies. Social workers are very much essential workers during this pandemic of COVID-19, um, and serve a critical role. And so, for that reason, it's important that you be good advocates um, for participation um, in the shaping of policy and procedures for social and political action, looking at underrepresented populations and marginalized communities, and being part of that social and political action to make change. That's part and parcel of social work practice, and we look for social workers to be advocates for change, both in policy and legislation, to improve those social conditions of those who are less able to be engaged or be a part of that change themselves. Um, so that is our last area of primary focus within the Code of Ethics. NASW. However, there's much more information on the NASW website, and I have that on the next slide for you. And here you can get more information about the NASW Code of Ethics, more detailed information than I'm able to provide in this limited time span. I encourage you to go to the website to download the information and keep it handy from the beginning of your classes throughout your social work career, just as a reference that you can look back at to help you resolve any conflicts you may have in your practice setting, questions that you may have during your clinicals, during your studies as a social work student. Just really critical information that will help guide your social work practice, your social work behavior. And finally, I'd like to end the overview of the NASW Code of Ethics with a group discussion. I like to always bring in different stakeholders and those with different perspectives so we can have a discussion about the applicability of these Code of Ethics to your practice area and how you internalize these areas that govern social work practice and social work behavior. I thank you, and again, my name is Dr. Diane Fuselier-Thompson.